afternoon, everyone. It's just gone 1:30 and we do have a number of people who've joined us today for our conversation about the power of the intergenerational wealth transfer opportunity that's happening in Australia. And we're going to talk today with a number of experts in this space. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land from which I'm coming to you today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future leaders today, who we all have the opportunity to work with. I know I can see many people coming in from all over our country, and really look forward to our conversation today. My name is Kristi Mansfield. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Seer Data and Analytics. This is my co-founder and chief data scientist, Adam Peaston. And many of you may know Adam is the data scientist behind the data set that has helped us understand more deeply the opportunity for wealth transfer in our country. I'd like to also introduce to you Krystian Seibert here, who, as many of you I'm sure know, is the Acting Policy and Research Manager at Philanthropy Australia. He's really led with Jack Heath the launch of the Blueprint last week, which is a foundational piece of work for how we think about growing giving in our country. And we had the great pleasure of being able to partner with Philanthropy Australia to provide the wealth transfer data set as part of that piece of work. So really grateful that you're here with us today, Krystian. Look forward to hearing about the Blueprint. And you may also know as well that Krystian is the Industry Fellow at the Centre for Social Impact. I'm also delighted to introduce to you Sarah Thompson, who's the Executive Director of Into Our Hands Foundation. And Sarah was the first person who came to us with this idea about, what is the potential of wealth transfer in her region. And she's going to talk a lot about how Into Our Hands has really driven this notion and vision for encouraging building of community philanthropy in the northeast of Victoria. And then I'm also delighted to introduce you to Peter Gordon, who's the CEO of Hands Across Canberra. And we've also had the great chance to work with Peter and his team in Canberra, who are also working on intergenerational wealth campaigns and using the data set that we've made available to them, to the team. Today is aimed at being a very interactive session. We really do want to have a great conversation with you all. So I can see many people from across the sector who have joined, very involved in the community foundation sector, and I thank you for being here today. People like Ben Rogers, Gerlind, and many others who are really foundational to helping us grow the community foundation sector and harness wealth transfer and the opportunity that it brings. So to kick us off today, I'm going to hand over to Krystian, who has some introductory remarks for us. And meanwhile, I do want to encourage everybody to throw your questions into the chat, and we will get to those as we go through the session today. So Krystian, over to you.
Thanks, Krystian. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully that all works okay. There we go. Can we all see that title page okay? Good. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to speak today, and I'll try and keep my remarks as brief as possible. But what I wanted to do is, many of you or all of you will know that last week at the Philanthropy Australia National Conference, we launched a blueprint to grow structured giving in Australia. So a roadmap setting out a way that we can, various ways that we can grow structured giving in Australia. And I wanted to sort of give a rundown of that, but also highlight two things. Well, how the wonderful data that Seer Data and Analytics made available was used, and the power of that data in terms of illustrating the opportunity of intergenerational wealth transfer, and also just zero in as well on the one of the initiatives in the blueprint, which is around supporting and growing community and place-based giving. So thank you. So yes, we launched it last week, and there'll be a link at the end of this presentation. And also want to acknowledge at the outset that in preparing this document and in presenting today, I wanted to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands in Australia, the land on which I'm on, which are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge, and this was in Jack, Philanthropy Australia CEO's forward to the document, that the tradition of giving and reciprocity and generosity is not a thing that arrived in Australia with colonialism. It's a thing that stretches back thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years in Australia's Indigenous culture and heritage. And so this is not, a new thing. This is building on something that has been going on for a very long time. And I also want to acknowledge that the work of the blueprint wouldn't be possible without Seer data and analytics and the fantastic data and analysis that you did, but also through the supporters of this work, including Perpetual and the Paul Ramsay Foundation, and underlining how important it is, if we want to grow giving, to invest in this kind of work and really appreciate that. And many others involved, both on this project. Social Ventures Australia played a key role delivering this, but also over many years doing all the research. We're really standing on the shoulders of giants in preparing this, as Kristi said, foundational documents, and that's a great pun for this, this report, this foundational document for how we can grow structured giving in Australia. So in terms of why this blueprint was conceived, it was conceived a couple of years ago by the Philanthropy Australia board, and I do acknowledge Joe Strinsky, who's here, who's one of our board members and chair of our policy and research committee. And this might be a little bit small to see, so sorry about that, but it is in the report. So you will get a copy of the, there is a link at the end where you can download a copy of the report, but I thought rather than rewrite what's in the report, I'll just use what's in the report, given I was proofreading it so much until the weekend before last. But in terms of why this blueprint was conceived, is that there was a view within Philanthropy Australia and the Philanthropy Australia board and management that there's a real opportunity to grow giving in Australia, structured giving in particular. So where some sort of structured, planned approach is taken to giving, there's going to be unprecedented transfer of wealth in coming years. And that's what we're here to talk about today, $2.6 trillion in the next 2 decades. Corporate giving, there's a real opportunity there, but at the same time, the proportion of Australians who give has been trending down. And whilst the number of wealthy Australians is increasing, the proportion of them who donate is actually decreasing. But there's also evidence that attitudes to giving are established early in life. And we're also seeing, again, what we're going to talk about today, the importance of community and place-based philanthropy. So a confluence of these various factors really provide an opportunity to grow giving. And it's not to replace government. Government has a key role providing for the welfare of the community, but to complement it and to do different things. And the core aspiration of the blueprint is to grow structured giving. So giving through private ancillary funds, public ancillary funds, sub-funds, will trusts, bequests, corporate giving, from where it is at the moment, and the estimate is $2.5 billion in 2020 to $5 billion in 2030, so doubling it. Now, as I said earlier, we wouldn't have been able to, well, we could have done it, but it wouldn't have been as good a piece of work. It wouldn't have been as impactful had it not been informed by the data and analysis from Seer data analytics. So, want to acknowledge that again, and sorry if the text is a bit small up there, but I really want to sort of zero in on this map and talking about sort of going back a few years ago now, and when I first saw the work that Seer had done with Sarah in the Wangaratta region around the potential in terms of intergenerational wealth transfer, and I was blown away by it. That such data could be pulled together and made usable, given that there's so much data out there, but often it's just incomprehensible and all over the place and it's not usable. So pulling it together, but also showing how much wealth there is in an area like Wangaratta. And I know there's a lot of, wealthy businesses and farmers, etc. there, but, we often think of wealth as something that happens in Toorak or Potts Point or that sort of thing, but the real diversity of where wealth is across Australia, and this heat map, which is based on data which Seer provided, sort of shows where a lot of this wealth is, including in regional areas in terms of the potential to the potential wealth transfer in these regions, and also some suburbs that we sometimes don't necessarily think of as having, you know, quite a large amount of wealth that will be transferred, such as Baulkham Hills, West Bella Vista in Sydney, for example. So really, there is this huge opportunity, $2.6 trillion over the next 20 years. But what is interesting is that bequest giving in Australia is pretty low, and it's about 7% of bequests wills have a bequest in them. And I think that if we just sort of kept it as business as usual, sure, could grow giving as part of the intergenerational wealth transfer, but it may not. I mean, there are some worrying trends as well. So part of the blueprint is about actually proactively saying that we want to grow it, seizing the opportunity, setting out a roadmap, and setting up a framework to work collaboratively to achieve that. And Philanthropy Australia, you know, is really pleased to be able to sort of, you know, have a leading role there, but working collaboratively with others. And just showing again the opportunities in terms of data. This is sort of, again, from the report, zeroing in on a particular set of, on a number of different regional areas, again, showing the total wealth transfer and the real potential there is in terms of wealth transfer, and how you know, some of that, hopefully, will go towards philanthropy. Now, this is what we call the blueprint on a page. Again, it's a bit small, but I wanted to share it because it's pretty important, and it sort of summarizes everything in one page, because the blueprint is framed around sort of doubling our structured giving by 2030. That's the objective. Then there are strategic priorities. On the left, which is your right, no, your left, you'll put my hands on your right, is protecting what we've already got. Now, that's sort of not necessarily having to do anything, but we've got some great foundations in Australia, mind the pun, in terms of policy and regulatory frameworks, tax incentives, that sort of thing. But it's important to protect that. Examples are refundable franking credits. They are an important source of income for trusts and foundations that enable them to grant more into the community. There are stories today in the media about certain organisations pushing for a standard deduction in tax returns. If that was introduced, it could actually decrease giving considerably, because it would remove a tax incentive for many people. So it's about protecting the foundations, but then also enhancing what we've got. So that can include new structures, such as what are called living legacy trusts, which can help grow bequest giving, that sort of thing, and a number of other initiatives in the targeting space, so focusing on particular areas or particular cohorts. And one of them is increasing community and place-based giving, and I want to just touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment. There are some initiatives that sit below that, and I won't go into every one because you can get the report, and the report goes into detail into each and every one. But they're spread over these different strategic priorities. But again, there are two around sort of cutting red tape to enable more place-based philanthropy, and also more broadly looking at other ways to facilitate community and place-based philanthropy. And finally, there are some enablers. If we want to do this, how are we going to do it? Well, we need a coalition, a collaborative process. We need enabling support in terms of resources, organisations that can contribute to doing this. Can't be done alone, and it shouldn't be done alone by Philanthropy Australia, and it is going to be a collaborative process. And funding and commitments from government. Some of it does rely on government doing things. So just in terms of the focus on community and place-based philanthropy, it was a very strong focus of the blueprint. And I think that reflects, you know, the wealth transfer potential in our regions, in place, but also in communities, in cities, and not just in regional areas. And what we've seen from overseas in terms of places like Canada, when government and other stakeholders got together and really worked together, there was, you know, an amazing shift in terms of community and place-based giving, and community foundations took off there. And so there's a lot of potential there. So there are a range of initiatives that have been looked at, including government and matched philanthropic grants, but also just things like the current DGR or deductible gift recipient framework really makes it hard for community foundations and imposes red tape on them, restricts their activities. Fixing that obviously requires policy change, could really have some benefits as well. So there's a package of things there. And again, the second stage of the blueprint, which I'll focus on now in terms of where we're going from here, will be about designing things further collaboratively, working together either to advocate for changes or design them further to refine them, because different initiatives are at different stages. So stage one is kind of what this report is, and it was satisfying getting it out, but it's really the start of just the next stage, which is a lot of work as well, which is further design, implementation, planning and resourcing. And then stage three is actually the real implementation and tracking progress. And then hopefully, fingers crossed, stage four is seeing the benefits and evaluating that. And the last thing I'll say is, or the second from last thing I'll say is that when you do read the blueprint report, and many of you will have already done that, you might think that there's a lot of stuff here, and there is, and there's a lot of work. But I think one thing that really showed was that there's no silver bullet to growing, giving and taking advantage of intergenerational wealth transfer in Australia. We need a strategy that's going to have lots of different parts to it. And that's what the blueprint does really reflect. And if you want to stay up to date with developments and would like to be involved going forward, please just send an email to appropriately in blue, blueprint@philanthropy.org.au. You can also download the full report, a summary report as well, there in PDF form. And yeah, and there's also some stories on the Philanthropy Australia website, sort of in shorter format, just highlighting some of the key points. So I think I've probably gone either at time or over time, so I'll finish up there.
Thanks so much, Krystian. Thank you very much for that introduction. We've had a couple of questions, so I'm hopeful you could just flip back, if you don't mind, to the map. And I want to answer Emily's question, which is, does this map reflect recent movement of people, especially out of cities to regional Australia? And I'm making the assumption, Emily, that you do mean the movement from cities to regional areas as a result of the COVID crisis. And then further, or is it based on where people were living in the last census? So I'll just hand to Adam to answer that one, and then we do have another one in a moment.
Yeah, great question, Emily, thanks. The model is based on a population model, which essentially accounts for, or assumes, if you like, that populations by location are aging in place, or the population is evolving in place. We did consider whether there was a scope to include or estimate the impact of migration internally or externally, and decided that the interaction or the potential interaction with wealth in each location was probably far more complicated than any set of assumptions we could make about that would permit. And the safest thing for us to do was essentially make the assumption that we did, which is to evolve that population in place and see what that result looked like. So I think that answers your question, or perhaps you can let me know if there's more to that question that you'd like me to go into.
So to summarize, it is based on the previous census, but what is interesting, of course, as we know, is this new census is being done on the 10th of August, which we as a data company are very excited about. And it'll be very interesting to see the shifts in population and household types through the next census. And that data is coming, as many people may know, available in April of next year.
There's a couple more questions there as well, which I'm happy to take, if that helps.
Yeah, sure.
So a question from Sue Fisher. Hi, Sue. We used to work together at Philanthropy Australia when Sue was Queensland State Manager. So what are the first actions to be taken with intermediaries, wealth advisors, and in what time frame? So great question, Sue. And yeah, unsurprisingly, the role of intermediaries, advisors as those who can start conversations with clients about engaging in philanthropy was highlighted again as really important. And a number of really interesting findings came out of the blueprint. firstly, we had some great engagement with organisations like the Financial Planning Association and some others who are really willing to sort of, have Philanthropy Australia work with them to provide educational opportunities for their members around philanthropy and the ways that they can work with the clients in terms of engaging in philanthropy. So that's sort of one thing that we'll be able to do hopefully relatively quickly this year. But the other really interesting insight is, and forgive me if I get into my sort of into the weeds of policy, but in Australia, the way that, say, financial advisors and planners are regulated, there is a vast amount of new regulation that has been introduced as a result of various inquiries and royal commissions. One of them is around education requirements for advisors, and the Treasurer has now been put in charge of setting the education requirements for, say, financial advisors and planners, and was suggested to us that you could include a requirement for some education around philanthropy, even just a few hours. So looking also at levers like that sort of through the policy space around trying to sort of get advisors more engaged. And Caroline asked, with place-based giving, how do you ensure that it does not lead to richer areas getting richer and poorer areas getting poorer? And that's a really good observation, Caroline, and thank you for the question. And it was something that we were thinking about and were certainly aware of when we were doing the blueprint. There is always that risk that where the areas that have wealth or social capital, etc., can they can then therefore obtain more funds for philanthropy and invest that in the community, whereas less well-off areas, poor areas won't have that. And I think that partly goes to the fact that the blueprint does have a focus on community and place-based giving, but it's also got to focus more broadly on giving and growing giving through various different levers and different ways. And then in terms of Philanthropy Australia's focus, we have a focus on more philanthropy, but also better philanthropy. And better philanthropy is about how you do philanthropy, doing it more effectively. And part of that is about highlighting areas where there is need, areas where there is insufficient philanthropy and where philanthropy could play an important role, but also ensuring that philanthropy is done in a way that empowers communities, shares power with them, grants them autonomy, etc. So that is also a focus on the better side. But Sarah might also have comments from a sort of place-based specific, or Peter as well. So that was just my sort of Philanthropy Australia hat sort of speaking.
Thank you, Krystian. That's great. Thank you so much. Sarah, I'm really interested to hear from you in terms of the progress that you've made and where you're up to with campaigning and what you've learned in the last sort of 18 months since we've been working on this work together.
Okay, thanks, Kristi, and thanks, Krystian. I think Krystian really framed this discussion really well, and I really commend the work of Philanthropy Australia and their partners for that blueprint. I think it's an amazing piece of work. And I think this is a really good place for me to pick up what we were thinking about when we looked into intergenerational wealth transfer strategies that they had been doing in the States for about 30 years. So we were thinking about three things at Into Our Hands Foundation when we were looking at this, or I was, and the foundation was thinking about some things too. We have our own organizational sustainability to think about as a kind of fledgling community foundation in a regional rural area. We're about 3 hours north of Melbourne and about an hour south of the New South Wales Victorian border. And we were also thinking about, how we build up a corpus of funds over a relatively short period of time, and how we change cultures of giving locally in our region to not just respond to crisis, but to be strategic. I was also thinking about, I'd got back from the States and I'd done some work over there. And I had been speaking to people locally, the Australian Centre for Rural Entrepreneurship and Matt Farlett up there in Beechworth, about ideas about growing philanthropy in place. And we knew that the community foundation sector was not growing at the same rate in Australia that it was in other parts of the world. And we also knew that 80% of community foundations in Australia are regional and rural. And so I felt like the sector needed another way of looking at growing philanthropy in place. And the third thing was that question about how do we make sure that regional rural communities get a share of the wealth and the intergenerational wealth transfer that is going on in our country, or people that have made wealth and moved away, or that are wealthy and live at other places and set up their private ancillary funds or their corporate foundations. And regional rural communities, when I got up here, I moved from the city 3 years ago. I was just astounded at how much they feel like they miss out, and how they don't have the networks in place to get philanthropic funds, and nor do they have enough eligible DGR item 1 charities to ensure that that money flows easily. So our services miss out a lot, and even in response to crisis and bushfire, we have to set up new structures and start from scratch often, because we don't have those institutions already set up in the region. So those are the 3 things we were thinking about. And in terms of our journey, we really looked at that experience of the Nebraska Community Foundation, and we had talks with Don Mackey, who's kind of like the godfather of these approaches in America. We were really impressed with the data over 30 years, building up corpus funds of 100 million. We then had Brian Fredericks come out, talk with our board, and look at our community and our foundation, whether there was potential for us to look at this. So again, he had been on the Fund for Economic Future of Ohio, built up assets of 100 million over 10 years, using this data-driven approach. So when we were looking at all that, this obviously was appealing, and the inspirational message to regional communities to allow them to dream big. And stop being held back by the feeling that we're poor and we can't get access to it. So that was what was quite inspirational about it. We were connected with Seer Data through a member of our board, and I'm so glad that he did connect us to Seer Data, because they've been an absolutely perfect partner, because we couldn't do this work justice without them. And also we couldn't lift this work to the national level that I thought it needed to be lifted to, and I just didn't have resources here to do that. So we were very focused on doing a report looking at the philanthropic potential of Northeast Victoria, and what we thought we could gift to the sector was funding the methodology of that for Australia and getting that right, and then handing that over to a partner like Seer, and talking with bigger funders like Perpetual to really kind of blow this wide open for Australia and make this replicable, adoptable, and accessible for all kind of organisations looking to raise funds. And that's what is starting to happen. So we're really pleased with that journey so far. So from a individual perspective, here in Northeast, though, we've published our report in 2019, and we've been working with another organisation who's been really great, and also referred to us through Seer, which is 89 Degrees East. And look, our journey with this is we're still learning, but what I would say is the data is only the first step, and Philanthropy Australia might be on board with us with that challenge, and same with Peter Gordon at Canberra. The data is only one step in the journey. The challenge now for us in the Northeast and all foundations using this stuff is, how do we package this up so that it is an easy message to community to understand, that the opportunity is grasped, and that we don't only educate community about the opportunity, but we move them to action. So we are working with 89 Degrees East to change the culture of philanthropy in Northeast Victoria, to move us from a crisis fundraising town and region who are really good when there's a family in a crisis or a fire, to being more strategic. And so, yeah, this is the hard piece of work now. And what I really love about transfer of wealth and the lessons and the learnings we've looked at from the US is, this was the first piece of work that I looked at that linked the idea of economic development and community development with philanthropy. And so it allows me as an organisation, or Philanthropy Australia, or any organisations looking to get this work funded, to make a better case for why organisations should fund this work, and why it shouldn't just be seen as a fundraising initiative or a bequest plan. It is so much more than that. And so that's the challenge now, is we've got a little bit of funding, and I should say that this work the first adopters to get on board with this with us was our local foundation, June Canavan Foundation. Extra Foundation has been a significant funder to allow us to trial this work in place. And the Australian government, Building Better Regions Fund, has come on board twice now over 3 years to help us do the modelling and the research. So it's a great example of government and philanthropy investing in regional community development approaches that are linked to philanthropy. And the challenge now is to allow us to have those funds in an ongoing way to really implement the campaign with the data and the messaging for community to start to change behaviours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So inspirational. I have some questions that I wanted to raise, but I thought I would wait until after we hear from Peter. In particular, I was really interested in your comment of moving from a crisis frame. And, that reminds me of so many communities around Australia, regional or urban. And so I'm really keen to pick that up a bit later. So firstly, before I do, Peter, I'd love to hear from you in terms of the work you're doing in Canberra and the ACT, in particular, your last 12 months and your future thinking around wealth transfer.
Thanks, Kristi. There's such big issues, and where we're at, I think where we're at as a group and under the leadership of Ben and Gerlin with the national approach to what we're talking about is that this is a national issue. So there are 40 community foundations in Australia. There are God knows how many other private funds and company-based funds and all this sort of stuff. And what the work that we're all doing now reflects is that we are turning this from a particular challenge of an organisation like Sarah's and mine into a national conversation. And how we have this conversation nationally, and it's not just what we've learned, it's not about rich people. It's not about going to someone and leaving me 100 million. We will achieve all the things that all of us want to do in $10,000 and $20,000 lots. So that's the realisation. So the idea that me in Canberra and some of my generous supporters are actually on this seminar, so I welcome hello to my friends out there that support Hands Across Canberra one way or another. The idea that a place like Canberra can have this conversation the same way that Sarah has is unimaginable unless you actually think 2 or 3 steps down the path about who we are and where we fit. Because I have exactly the same challenge in Canberra, saying, why would we give to a Canberra foundation when Canberra's good? Canberra's fine. Canberra's only fine for those that are fine. There are a lot of people that aren't fine, and Australia is exactly the same. So if we have a conversation about how you transfer normal life into things that pass through one of our foundations or another recipient organisation, and that allows that whole multiplier effect to happen, whether it's in your own community or more broadly through the communities, that's the conversation that we need to have, and that's what we need to rehearse amongst ourselves. Is that we the people that are around this teleconference know what we're talking about. We've got another 25 million people to talk to yet. So, and it's not just the financial advisors or the lawyers or the will makers or the rich people. It's everybody. So that is. Sarah and I are in a group working with Ben and in the community foundation world is that the challenge that we have is not whether there's enough money. We know because of the great work that Seer and Philanthropy Australia have done, there's plenty of dough. Money's not the issue. Getting people to say yes is the issue. So therefore, why would someone give me $20,000 to invest forever as opposed to give me $25,000 to build a new training van at the PCYC in Tuggeranong? So it's really just part of the storytelling, communications thing, which we are rehearsing. As I say, we're rehearsing it here in Canberra now at this very point in time, because we haven't translated the Seer data into action yet. We're literally weeks away. But I think if we can continue to build amongst the believers, that we've got something to sell. The numbers speak for themselves. How do we translate that into specific action? That's the challenge for us all. We don't need to be convinced. No one on this call needs to be convinced. But as I said, we've got 25 million people to convince, and there are some national action that's got to be taken. That PA's got a role to play in that, but it's more, I don't know whether it's governments or I don't know, I don't know who this national body is going to carry it forward, but there is a national conversation to be had.
Thanks,
I
Peter.
could talk for a lot longer, but I don't think we need to.
So just to invite everybody to do send your questions over. So just thinking about the last 12 months, Sarah and Peter, I know that you have been campaigning and raising funds in the community for the foundation, and also talking to or about to launch the wealth transfer campaigns. What have you learned? What surprised you, Sarah? And what is encouraging you?
Look, we're still coming up against that age-old question that Peter's talking about, is why would we give it to you to put in a bank account and grow when I can give some money for a family affected by domestic violence and see impact or feel rewarded for that straight away. So we still deal with that even with that data, and we still have to answer those questions and come up with a better sell and a better message for people about endowment and structured giving. So we're looking at that through that working group with Australian Community Philanthropy. What's surprising me is that the data doesn't do the work for us. We still have to create the messaging from the data, and obviously we use key takeaways from the data. But what is really resonating in my community that I'm using more than anything else is actually, well, it is the data, but it's a new layer of data that we didn't have in 2019, and that's the propensity to give data. So, as Peter said, we know there's money in the region here, and we know there's people that have capacity to give, and we want to change their behaviours. But what's really influencing people to that point of view who are not already on board is the fact that these communities know they're generous. They know they're generous per head, per capita sort of stuff. I don't know if people watch, but the Good Friday appeal 3 weeks ago in Victoria, Wangaratta was out fundraising towns like Geelong and Ballarat and suburbs of Melbourne at a rate of a population of 30,000. So these communities know they're generous, and the propensity to give data says it layers volunteering data with giving data, donations and tax deductible donations data. And so in a place like Wangaratta, volunteering's at 95, 98%, and giving, even if it might be, $25 a year, but per person, giving per capita is at 95%. So when you layer those two pieces of data, when I go to local government and talk about these ideas and investing in growing philanthropy in the region, they get that. And they know that their communities are generous. They know they're good at fundraising, and suddenly they can see the need to invest more in growing structured giving and giving that's going to have more long-term impact. So that's been a real lesson. I thought it would be the key figures like, 1.6 billion over 5 years and those kinds of figures that would impact people, but it's actually those layerings of data that people already understand.
Isn't that interesting? So that people, they resonate with, we are a generous community. Then it's that piece, that bridge, I suppose, which is what yourself and Peter are talking about, which is then how do you encourage that action around bequest or structured giving or named funds. For everyone who's on the webinar, the propensity to give data came about because as we were working with Philanthropy Australia and SVA, Social Ventures Australia, on the wealth transfer data, the question of course came up, well, that's great. We now know the quantum and the locations, and we can look at it at 5-year intervals. But if we were to implement interesting strategies to encourage people to be more philanthropic and therefore grow giving, which is the goal, where would we focus efforts? And we did a data science piece of work to look at whether or not there was a relationship between volunteering and charitable donations. Now, all of us working in the sector have read reports and studies that have been done that give feedback and qualitative research around this connection, but we had not seen a data science piece of work that shows that in fact there is a relationship there. And there's a positive relationship. And in fact, the relationship is higher in areas where there are more economic resources, in fact. And so the Giving Index is a data set available through Seer if you would like to see the propensity to give of geographic locations where you're based. You can jump in and it's a free data set you can work with to identify that. So that was a really good value add. And I think that's helping people understand the areas where there's wealth transfer and there's also very high levels of giving. And that's the case certainly in the ACT, Peter. I mean, it's fascinating and wonderful to see so many suburbs in Canberra with such high propensity to give factors. So, and I know you had a really amazing year last year through the crisis of people contributing. Any particular learnings there that you were happy to share with the group?
Yeah, there's a lot. What we do know from ATO data is that Canberrans are the most generous people in Australia per capita. And what we also know is that almost all that generosity leaves Canberra. So we're a generous people, we volunteer a lot, we donate a lot, but we don't have any view about local impact. And so that's one of the things that we did have a spectacular year last year, like many foundations did, because community foundations come into their own in times of crisis, and that's this place-based operation as well. So we all become much more real and relevant. I think the correlation between what we learned last year and what we intend to do is that, and it sort of comes down to the Canadian thing, like many of us went to Canada a couple of years ago to the Community Foundation Conference, and it really didn't dawn on me how they actually do it, how the Canadians get $1 billion in the bank. That sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But they get it in small chunks. They get it in $10,000 and $20,000 lots. And it's only when you see how you translate $1 billion into Canberra suburb by suburb that you can actually see how it can actually happen. And so this business, this national conversation that we're talking about is we don't need another fire. We don't need another COVID problem. We need some bit of clear air so we can get into the business of promoting the future, which is like we've got a 20-year plan to have $100 million in the bank, right? And so we've got $4 million in the bank now. We've got an awful long way to go, but 100 million is not 100 million. 100 million is 100 divided by 10,000, 10,000, 10,000, 10,000. So, and then when you get, then add your science on top of it, the propensity to give, the willingness to give, the option for volunteering, correlations, and therefore the outrageous amount of money that Canberrans have got in houses and superannuation, bang, you got a deal. But the layering's got to get done. And I think the layering that we started last year because of the terrible nature of 2020, it actually gives us a platform to move forward rather than say we've done enough. So it's an interesting build, but the build up has to be a national conversation, because we don't want to be competed. We don't compete with Sarah. We don't compete with anybody. That's one of the great things about this business. We're not in the competition business. We're in the competition business for money just disappearing down the family black hole, So, and it can all just be down the family black hole. They just need a little bit, seriously, a little bit of that behind, and all of a sudden we've got a deal. So it's a conversation that just needs to build and build and build and build and build. And yeah, we're going to need a lot of help. We all need help with that.
And I would just add to that, Kristi, in terms of the $10,000 or $20,000 lots, one of the things that we've also done with the data, which we didn't do with the report, is we've been starting to move to a campaign. And so what are those messages? And we're looking at, love your place, love your community. What could you do in order to ask people and community the question? And we're moving to this message of just 5%, which is a message that a lot of foundations will have seen from America. But we got to the 5% figure too, because of the modeling, if 10% of people in our region gave 5%, that starts to build up an endowment fund that is significant and can do great things. But then looking at what 5% is, when we broke that down by household, we are talking about between $20,000 and $30,000 per person in this region. And so then that starts to make a gift in a will at $20,000 or $30,000. Oh, I could do that. If I did that, that won't hurt my super fund. I'll still be able to look after my family. I'll still be able to give my kids a deposit. Whatever people's worries are in that market, when we broke it down by 5% of household net wealth, it was doable. And so when you look at those areas that Krystian presented earlier for Toorak and Potts Point, where you've got a household net wealth of 4 million or something, you know, I'm working with 700,000 or 800,000 here. You know, 5% is obviously a bigger figure, but it's all relative, and it may be achievable to those cohorts in those more wealthy areas as well. So it's the breaking down of the data and packaging it in a way that's digestible, that's working.
Yeah, one thing we often reflect on is there are really three types of people. There's the idealists that will believe that, you know, by contributing, they're going to make a difference and they don't need to see the data set. But the largest group of people are those that understand the rational argument and need a data point. And that's, you know, hopefully what we're contributing to. Then there's the other people, they need a lot of data. And Gerlyn's just raised as well the importance of being able to demonstrate to people who you're working with what the needs are in the community through incredible work such as Canberra, you know, your work with Vital Signs, Peter, and many community foundations have implemented the Vital Signs framework that ACP supports and encourages others to do. Krystian, just thinking about that, I mean, you've heard about some of the practical challenges, you know, of Sarah and Peter to translate what I think I'm hearing is we're a great crisis-giving town, state, nation. That came out a little bit as well. So and then how to translate that into more structured long-term giving. Based on your insights in the conversation today, what are your thoughts on what needs to happen, and what's Philanthropy Australia's support of that?
Thanks, Kristi, and some great comments and perspectives from Sarah and Peter. And I think I would just echo in terms of the data, it's, you know, the propensity to give data, and that it really sort of brings things to life, say in the blueprint, and shows the opportunity that we've got. And you know, as we look into particular areas in more detail, you know, I think that'll be, you know, the data will be really important and helpful in that regard as well. I think another powerful aspect of the data is that when we say go to government and say, well, you know, we'd like you to do this, this and that, and, you know, we have to be realistic about what government will and won't do in terms of policy, etc. You can sort of, you know, say, well, this is the opportunity, and you can go to a, you know, let's just say we want to get, you know, improved regulatory and taxation frameworks for community foundations. We can go to a local member of parliament, you know, that's, you know, the federal MP, and show them, well, this is the potential in the area, but this is the sort of, this is the red tape that we've got at the moment. And it sort of really brings things to life in that regard. I think, and I'll go back to sort of what I said earlier about what I think sort of needs to happen, or what, you know, where we will go from, probably will want to go from here. And I think that the blueprint, as you'll see if you've read it, or when you read it, is that it's quite broad in terms of the different initiatives and focus areas. And I think that sort of was a bit of a realization from me working on it. I'm a person that kind of likes to think, oh, there's, you know, 2 or 3 things that we could do. And I naturally, because of who I am, I zero in on some technocratic policy solution to kind of, you know, some sort of tax thing to kind of focus on because it's tangible. But there is no silver bullet. There's an array of different things that need to be sort of pursued if we're going to grow structured giving in Australia. And I think that's why there's, you know, many different initiatives across different groups and different cohorts, but also different approaches will work in different ways. So there is a massive opportunity to grow ultra high net wealth giving in Australia. So in the Potts Point or the Toorak or the Brighton, where I am right now, for example, there's particular approaches for that that might work there, that might not work in other areas. But also thinking more broadly, as a society, I think we do want to make sure, we do want to encourage ultra high net wealth people to give more, but we want to also be mindful that if we see that grow very considerably, we'll see a concentration of giving from a particular group, whereas we want to have giving kind of broadly based across, you know, the different groups in society that have capacity to give. And that's why the blueprint itself has got a broad focus on different groups and cohorts rather than just zeroing in on one particular one. But I think in terms of where we'll need to go, I mean, stage 2 will be about sort of the collaborative process in terms of, you know, designing particular initiatives in more detail. And then some of them, well, to be honest, we've been talking about DGR reform for community foundations for a long time. The solutions are there. And so it's about maybe sort of, hopefully, you know, this time in terms of collectively having the kind of impetus maybe from government and others to sort of try, you know, they could fix it pretty easily if they wanted to be honest. The solutions are there. So across different initiatives are at different stages and really kind of taking them forward, and Philanthropy Australia kind of working with others to sort of do that, but also, you know, having the kind of backbone capacity to sort of assist that. And look, there'll be some things where others will take the lead. And obviously, you know, ACP, Australian Community Philanthropy, fantastic organisation that really shows leadership in this space. And, you know, obviously community and place-based philanthropy, you know, it's an area where Philanthropy Australia, you know, has very clearly wants to be involved, but also, you know, ACP is doing an amazing job, and we want to sort of work together to sort of, you know, support and reinforce ACP's leadership in this space.
Thanks, Krystian. Just had a question come through. It's a great one, because when I was running the Sydney Community Foundation, I came up against this quite a bit as well, because the large bulk of our structured giving donors were not high net worth givers. And you can, you know, when we look at the wealth transfer data in Sydney, and I have this conversation with Jane Joyce, the CEO of Sydney Community Foundation, quite a bit, which is this expectation that it should be, you know, a very large corpus of funds, yet we still need to change this perception that it's not just about high net worth giving. Sarah and Peter, how do we change that perception that it's not just about high net worth giving?
Look, I mean, we in Wangaratta and this region, Northeast Victoria, we've had to look at introducing accessible models of philanthropy, because it was, you know, even the word philanthropy excludes people here, and we've had to explain what philanthropy and endowments are to people. You know, our solution to that is place-based giving and kind of community funds. So we are looking at that as a strategy, and basically having funds either seeded or already set up that people can give to. I mean, we're even dealing with we're dealing with lotto winners locally who've won a significant amount, you know, and you know, they want to give back, but we have to make it really easy and comfortable for them. And so they're not a family that may traditionally have had wealth advisors or private wealth. And so they haven't come to philanthropy and structured philanthropy probably through the normal pathway. They've discovered us as the community foundation, and they're interested in community giving and being part of a group. So that's kind of how we've started to change that perception. And we've also tried to be an organisation locally that rather respond to crisis, we are trying to shine a light on the underbelly of our community and bring the causes to bear and front of mind. So, you know, we have a family domestic violence issue in our region, you know, further compounded by COVID. We have a lot of kids that live with grandparents or in care. We have a number of foster care services locally. People know that in the town, but they kind of forget. So we're trying to bring those issues front of mind, as opposed to, you know, not to kind of say that Cancer Council and Relay for Life and all these kind of events that are kind of a really big feature of regional communities and their fundraising schedule throughout the year are not important and worthy causes, but we're just trying to, I guess, bring the causes front of mind. And if you are going to give at that accessible level, let's coordinate assets, pool resources. And if we're going to do a big event with the Rotary and the Lions and the RSL, and let's all do it together and look at strategically how we respond to that issue as a community, as opposed to doing it in a piecemeal approach. So it's a little bit maybe of that collective impact approach and some of that thinking. That's probably not a super adequate answer, but that's how we're thinking about it. And that's how we're trying to make philanthropy more accessible for people who have not traditionally come to philanthropy or come from a background where they've understood what that is.
Thanks, Sarah. Peter, did you?
Yeah, we all have the same challenge, expressed variously and differently. But there's a couple of perspectives. One is that my belief is that philanthropy is a body contact sport. So whenever you put someone who needs something next to somebody who wants to do something, they always say yes. How can I help? So making those direct human connections is part of what we do, and we've got a whole bunch of techniques and strategies around doing that, which sort of works. It's very patient philanthropy, but it works. The other is that, I keep referring to my Canadian experience, but Canadians call their perpetual fund, investment in their perpetual fund, the gateway drug for family philanthropy, where all you got to do is get one member of the family to put the first 10 grand in, and all of a sudden all the family's committed. So I think, again, that's that patient sort of philanthropy bit is that once we get enough individuals in families to sign up, the pipeline sort of tends to look after itself. But also the role of the JB Weir manage our money, and the influence that they will have, as will other financial advisors and wealth managers up into the system, will be phenomenal. And that's clearly part of our job going into the next little while, is to convince as many of them to have that philanthropic, leave something behind conversation, give while you live conversation with their clients, because they're the ones that they'll listen to. So if we sell the message that there is something to be done and that people will look after your money beautifully and spend it wisely, but yet the money has to come in to the tin at some stage or other, and that's got to come through, so that this broad network of financial advisors and others. So but I also think the people like JB, we know how committed JB Weir are and how fantastic they are. Maybe they've got a role with their competitors as well somehow or others to get them to do what they do. So there's a huge pipeline of work to get done, but the getting started is the trick. Getting enough families to say, I'm in, are you in, and getting that to roll out. So we just got to start at the start.
Thanks, Peter. Krystian.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I know we're sort of up against time. The other thing I was going to add is that we use the term high net wealth, ultra high net wealth in the report. On page 7 of the report, if you've looked at it or when you look at it, there's a blue box called a note on the changing nature of wealth in Australia. And it was interesting to me as well, because we inherited these terms and we decided to keep using them rather than come up with a new one, because they're used, and we sort of, probably weren't going to go out and invent a new one. We could use people with wealth or something, or people with resources or something like that. But the definition of high net wealth is actually those with investable assets over $1 million. So it's pretty low. It's a pretty low threshold. I'm not in it yet, but at some stage, because of intergenerational wealth transfer, it's quite possible I will be. I know other people who will be as well. So it's not that, but I won't be going to the chairman's lounge when I'm flying, at the airport. So it's still, wealth has changed in Australia. It's grown, but also there is obviously inequality, etc. But the definitions haven't moved necessarily. So people might not perceive themselves as high net worth, but actually based on the definitions used, they are. And that also just shows that there is sort of, just the changing nature of wealth in Australia, that this definition is somewhat outdated, perhaps as well. But taking the point too that words like philanthropy, high net wealth, particularly in a country like Australia, they can conjure up. I don't do philanthropy, that's for really rich people sort of thing. I'm not high net wealth. I remember talking to a person from a community foundation just around the blueprint, and I said, well, most of your sub-fund holders will be high net wealth because this is the definition of it. And to set up a sub-fund with $100,000 in it, you probably need to have, a bit more than $1 million of investable assets. So it's an interesting one there. There certainly is a thing with the wording. I don't think we're going to change philanthropy. I think we've sort of got that one, and I do like what it means in ancient Greek, but love of humanity. But yeah, high net wealth, ultra high net wealth, maybe the numbers need to be moved, or maybe we need a different term. Yeah.
Thanks, Krystian. That's great. Well, we are out of time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I'll just do a quick summary that it's clear that, thanks, Krystian, for the introduction. There is a vast opportunity that Philanthropy Australia is really advocating for the opportunity to be harnessed. We've heard from Sarah and Peter in terms of the practical work that you're doing on the ground. And thank you for all of that work and being so early in advocating for wealth transfer campaigns that the whole sector, community foundation sector, but also more broadly the not-for-profit sector can learn from. I understand from all the work ACP is doing, Ben and Gerlinde and Philanthropy Australia together, that there'll be more national focus and dialogue around this, which really does need to be funded. So philanthropic grant makers and or government grant makers who see the opportunity to invest in Hands Across Canberra and into our hands and the community foundation sector to really turbocharge this opportunity is wonderful. We've also heard that the data is only one component. It helps tell a story. And it's really the campaigning and storytelling, as well as demonstrating what the needs are in the community and how we can all work together to love the communities that we live in, to build that asset for our future is really what we're all about as a sector. Thanks, Krystian, for dropping those notes in. We'll also send you the links that came through in the chat. Thank you very much for your time today and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.